guest today is Dr. Timothy Snyder, an American historian and author of several award-winning books. One of his most recent works is titled Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, which was named Book of the Year by various publications and has been translated into over 20 languages worldwide. Dr. Timothy Snyder, thank you for sitting down with us today.
Very glad I could.
Tell us about the Bloodlands and what it is you hope to achieve by writing this book.
Well, the Bloodlands mean the place where most of the victims of Hitler and Stalin lived and died. This is the place where almost all of the German policies of mass killing were implemented and where a disproportionate amount of the Soviet killing took place as well. In today's terms, it means the Baltic states, Western Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and most of Poland. These are the lands where the Holocaust happened. These are the lands where Soviet and German power were both present. So the book begins from that observation. There was a time and a place where 14 million people were deliberately murdered. Between 1933 and 1945, 14 million people were deliberately murdered. Given that observation, given the weight of that fact, I thought it was important both to be able to describe each of the policies which led to this terrible total, but also try to explain each of them and to try to give some account of the overall catastrophe. That's the goal of the book.
In the West, people are familiar with the story of Anne Frank, the operations of D-Day, the Battle of Britain, and the murder of 6 million Jews. Now, in your book you write, in the middle of the 20th century, the Nazi and Soviet regimes murdered some 14 million people in an area that extends from central Poland to western Russia. Now, that's not something one hears very often in the West. Why is there such a gap in awareness of the Bloodlands here in the West?
Well, first of all, I would say that I'm happy whenever any public knows anything about history. I mean, even in the knowledge of the Holocaust, for decades there wasn't a clear understanding of what had happened. And even today, even our understanding of the Holocaust, I would say, is quite incomplete, impartial. And it's partial in one of the ways that you've suggested, which is that it generally has in mind people like Anne Frank. So Western victims. Anne Frank was a German citizen hiding in the Netherlands. In fact, those Western victims of the Holocaust are a relatively small percentage. The Holocaust that we think we know, we don't know, because we imagine Germany, we imagine Western Europe. Whereas in fact, the Holocaust is the largest of the mass crimes that truly took place in Eastern Europe. Most of its victims were East European. It happened in Eastern Europe. And once you make that simple geographical step, you recognize that it happened, so to speak, in the company of other German policies of mass killing, and that on the same territory, other policies of mass killing carried out by the Soviets also took place. But to make that geographical leap requires a certain amount of imagination, because from an American or even a British or Canadian point of view, you see the war where your armies were. So you see France, you see part of Germany, you see Italy, you might see North Africa. But the Western Allies never actually penetrated into the lands where all these crimes took place. So we'd like to think that we liberated Europe, but there are two senses in which that's not quite true. We didn't actually get to the places where the Germans committed their worst crimes, and of course the Soviets committed some of the crimes too, and it was they who liberated literally all of the worst of the death facilities, and of course Soviet power remained for another 45 years after that.
From time to time, we are met with the inaccurate term Polish concentration camps in the media, which is extremely unfortunate. This is something that you may have seen yourself. Now, what goes through your mind when confronted with such gross errors of the historical record?
Well, I mean, first of all, no one is perfect. You know, there was Bereza Kartuska, and there was the fortress at Brześć, right? So there were actually Polish concentration camps, but no one is thinking of those when they say that. I think that it's a very strange mistake to make, and it's taken a very long time for the Western media to catch up to this mistake. But as you probably know, they have. I mean, the New York Times' style book now prohibits that formulation. That's only been true for about a year, but it is true. I think it comes from a misunderstanding of what the Holocaust actually was. I mean, these were the facilities that are in question, Auschwitz. These were German facilities which were established on conquered Polish territory. It's really a very elementary mistake. I'm not quite sure what stands behind it, aside from the really insufficient understanding of the event, as we were talking about earlier. Once you understand that the Holocaust involves Germany moving east, destroying the Polish state, moving east again, attacking the Soviet Union, and thereby not only destroying East European political entities, but coming to control a large number of Jews. If you just know that simple thing, then the idea that these were Polish camps no longer really makes any sense. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that for a lot of people for a long time in the Cold War, Poland wasn't a real place. You know, Poland was just, it was a kind of shadow, it was a kind of specter, it was a place where bad things had happened. But it wasn't a real country with real people whose sensitivities we would have to respect. But fortunately that has changed. I mean, it's changed all too slowly, but I think it has changed.
Now, when writing this book, was there anything that surprised you, or was there a moment while doing your research that you were left stunned?
Well, I should say the whole premise of the book is a certain kind of surprise. The surprise that you can see the history in terms of one overarching tragedy, and not just a series of separate events categorized by nation or categorized by system or by the ideology of the perpetrators. And I was surprised again and again by individual discoveries which didn't seem to fit the larger stories in which I too was educated. You know, the book is partly a struggle against my own education, just as it is a struggle against everyone else's education. So in that sense, I was surprised all the time. But what I tried to do in the book is write the history in a very conservative, moderate way, rather than directly challenging the various myths and misunderstandings that we all tend to have from one direction or another, to try to build up an entire picture in a convincing way that wouldn't, rather than challenging these things directly, would provide a kind of alternative and I hope better and more comprehensive picture of the whole event. Of course I was stunned all the time. I mean, the nature of writing about this subject is to be stunned, but I think precisely because the subject is so important, we have to bear down and carry on and do our best.
Now, could you tell us about some of your upcoming works that we should be on the lookout for?
Well, there's a book which has just been published, which is called Thinking the 20th Century, which is a book of conversations about 20th century ideas, political ideas, intellectuals, and politics, which I carried out with my friend and colleague Tony Judt during some of the last months of his life. That's just been published. And then in the years to come, I'm thinking of writing an introductory history of Eastern Europe, a kind of thing that would be accessible for everyone around the world, and thinking about it in global terms. So not just the Polish nation and the Czech nation and so on, but how the revolutionary moment of the 1780s and 90s was a global event in which Poles, along with Frenchmen and Americans and so on, were taking part. Broadening the scope of East European history and trying to show how world history only makes sense with East European history and East European history only makes sense with world history. I also have ideas for a little book about Marx, a little book about the Holocaust, and I'm writing another book, an East European book about families where brothers chose different national identities and became important in different national movements. So as usual, I'm doing a lot of different things, and I only know what I'm really going to finish until I'm just about finished with it. Bloodlands was the only book that I carefully planned from beginning to end, and that way it was special.
Dr. Timothy Snyder, award-winning author and American historian, thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Very glad I could. Thank you.